Okay, so today we are diving into some pretty deep waters today. Vladimir Putin.
Hmm.
A lot of you have requested this, wanting to kind of look beyond the headlines, right? Get to the man behind, well, the image, right?
Yeah.
So to do that, we're going to be going through, exploring excerpts from Putin, Architect of Conflict.
Okay.
And I gotta say, this isn't just your average, dry biography. This thing reads like a political thriller.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it starts right from the beginning with Putin's early life in Leningrad.
Okay.
Tough upbringing, factory worker mom, strict Navy dad.
Right. Sounds about right.
Yeah, it sounds almost expected, right?
Yeah.
Until, oh, you factor in the grandfather, being a personal chef to Lenin and Stalin.
Wow. Okay, that's not just dinner table conversation. That's a front row seat to, some of the most significant power dynamics in history.
Right. I mean, imagine young Vladimir
Yeah.
just absorbing all of that, seeing how power operates at that level, like on a personal level. I mean, do you think that kind of early exposure had a lasting impact on his worldview?
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
this wasn't just proximity to power. It was intimacy with it.
Yeah.
Even in the Soviet system, I mean, this kind of direct exposure was unusual.
Hmm.
And, you see these echoes of those early experiences really, I think, throughout his entire career. It's fascinating.
It really is. And it makes you wonder if those years, those really early formative years, if they planted the seeds, so to speak, for the man he would become.
Right. Right.
And speaking of, well, career, that's where the story takes, I think, a truly intriguing turn. And that is the KGB.
Yeah.
Secret identities, whispers of connections to terrorist groups. There are even allegations of him destroying files as the Berlin Wall is literally crumbling around him. It's like something out of a spy novel.
It is, yeah. And you have to remember, I mean, a lot of that period, it's still shrouded in secrecy.
Yeah.
It's a lot of rumor versus, verified fact.
Yeah.
But what is clear is that this period was, really formative for Putin. This is where his distrust of the West
Right.
really took root.
Right.
Witnessing the Soviet collapse firsthand, which, he later called a geopolitical catastrophe.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's crucial context, I think, for understanding his actions today.
Absolutely. I mean, that's where, this is where it gets really, really interesting. So the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, most people, they would be scrambling to find their footing in that kind of upheaval, right?
Oh, yeah.
But not Putin. He lands a position as an advisor to the mayor of Leningrad, Anatoly Sobchak. It seems like, he has this knack for kind of landing on his feet.
Yeah, and this is where, I think we see that duality that defines so much of Putin's early career. On one hand, he's praised for his competence, his ability to navigate these complex situations, get things done. But on the other hand, there's this persistent shadow of scandal, like, the metal export investigation that's detailed in the book.
Right. Millions of dollars allegedly vanishing. Putin gets investigated, but somehow he emerges really with his reputation intact.
Almost like he was Teflon coated,
Yeah.
just deflecting any real scrutiny.
Yeah, it really highlights his remarkable ability to not just survive, but thrive in the chaos of the post-Soviet world.
Yeah.
Take, for example, his resignation from the KGB. Officially, it was in protest of the coup against Gorbachev. But then he turns around and shields Yeltsin from corruption charges once he becomes president. It makes you question, his motivations.
It really does. It's almost like he was playing both sides,
Yeah.
very carefully positioning himself for the future. And speaking of positioning, I mean, the way he orchestrated his rise to power is both fascinating and honestly a little disturbing.
Yeah.
So he forms the Our Home Russia Party, begins, this ascent through the ranks, prime minister, then acting president after Yeltsin's surprise resignation, which, let's be honest, brilliant strategic move.
Right.
I mean, in the space of just a few years, Putin goes from a relatively unknown figure to holding the reins of the entire country.
Yeah.
And from there, well, his rise becomes even more audacious.
And he doesn't waste any time once he has that power. First decree as president, legal immunity for Yeltsin and his family, effectively shutting down any further investigation into those corruption allegations. That's a bold move, even for Putin.
Bold, strategic, and a clear signal of his priorities. He understood that consolidating power meant rewarding loyalty, even if it meant turning a blind eye to past indiscretions. And initially, he projected a willingness to work with the West, even suggesting Russia might join NATO someday.
Which, knowing what we know now, seems almost unthinkable. What do you make of that? Was it a genuine overture or just another calculated move?
It's a question that's puzzled many analysts. It's possible he was genuine, at least at first, But it also served his immediate need to project stability, to reassure both the Russian people and the international community as he solidified his grip on power. And it's during this period that he makes deals with the oligarchs, these incredibly wealthy, powerful individuals who emerged from the ashes of the Soviet Union. He needed their support, or at least their acquiescence, to maintain his position.
But then events like the Kursk submarine disaster and the Moscow theater hostage crisis put his leadership to the test. These were tragic situations, and the book suggests his response was, well, less than empathetic, more focused on controlling the narrative than on showing genuine compassion.
Those events exposed a pattern that would become all too familiar. Tragedy strikes, and Putin uses the opportunity to further consolidate his power. It's a cynical observation, but one that's hard to ignore when you look at the arc of his presidency. And that pattern repeated during his second term, which he won by a landslide, although the book does raise questions about potential voting irregularities.
Right, and then there's the Beslan school siege, a horrific act of terrorism that shook Russia to its core. How did that event, with its devastating loss of life, impact Putin's hold on power?
It reinforced his hardline stance on Chechnya, his willingness to use overwhelming force against what he perceived as terrorism. It also seemed to deepen his resolve to eliminate any potential threats to his authority, both internal and external. This is when we see the arrest and imprisonment of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the oil tycoon who dared to challenge Putin's power.
That was a huge deal. Khodorkovsky was once one of the wealthiest men in Russia, and Putin essentially made an example of him. It sent a chilling message, not just to the oligarchs, but to anyone who might consider challenging his rule.
Exactly. It was a clear message: loyalty above all else. Step out of line, and there will be consequences. And it worked. The oligarchs fell in line, choosing self-preservation over dissent. And with his power seemingly unchallenged, Putin entered a new phase of his rule, the Medvedev years.
This is where things get really interesting. Constitutionally barred from a third consecutive term, Putin backs Dmitry Medvedev as his successor. But many saw it as a way for Putin to maintain control while respecting the letter of the law, wouldn't you say?
It was a clever maneuver. Putin became prime minister, but it was clear he was still the one calling the shots. And this arrangement allowed him to continue shaping Russia's role on the world stage, as we saw with the 2008 invasion of Georgia.
That invasion felt like a watershed moment. It was a clear signal to the West that Putin was not content with the status quo, that he had ambitions to restore Russia to what he saw as its rightful place as a global power.
Absolutely. And it set the stage for the even more consequential events that would unfold in Ukraine. But before we delve into that, let's talk about Putin's return to the presidency in 2012. Was it ever really in doubt?
Knowing what we know about his control over the political system, it almost felt inevitable, didn't it? But that return marked a significant shift in his approach, a hardening of his stance, both domestically and internationally. And, that shift, it really came to a head with the 2014 annexation of Crimea and then, of course, the conflict in Ukraine.
Right.
I mean, that's when things, I think, dramatically escalated, both for, Russia's relationship with the West, but also Putin's grip on power at home.
Absolutely. I mean, those events, I think, were a real turning point. Suddenly the narrative shifts away from, economic progress and towards this idea of nationalistic fervor of Russia, being surrounded by enemies.
Right.
And Putin was incredibly adept at harnessing that sentiment.
Yeah.
And using it to solidify his control.
The book portrays this as, a calculated risk that at least domestically paid off. His approval ratings, they skyrocketed after Crimea, even as, the international community is condemning his actions. Why do you think that is? What is it about Putin, do you think, that resonates so deeply with the Russian people, even in the face of, global disapproval?
I think to understand that, you have to remember the deep, psychological scars that were left by the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
The loss of superpower status, the economic turmoil, that sense that Russia had been, diminished on the world stage.
Right.
These were wounds that had never truly healed, and Putin tapped into that. He positioned himself as the restorer of Russian pride, the strong leader who would stand up to the West and reclaim, what he saw as Russia's rightful place.
And that message amplified by, let's be honest, a tightly controlled media landscape.
Right.
It clearly resonated, at least with a significant portion of the population.
Yeah.
But what about the dissent? The book mentions protests, the Pussy Riot demonstration, this kind of growing unease among some of the oligarchs who once, benefited from his rule. How does that factor into all of this?
Well, it's true. There have always been those who dared to challenge Putin's authority.
Right.
And those challenges have been met with, well, swift and often brutal repression.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to acknowledge the genuine support he enjoys, particularly among those who crave stability, who long for, the perceived order of the Soviet era.
Okay, yeah.
The question is, as sanctions bite deeper, as the war in Ukraine grinds on, will that support hold?
That is the billion-ruble question, isn't it? And, the book does, I think, a fantastic job of portraying Putin as this kind of master strategist, this really shrewd operator who's always, it seems like he's always several steps ahead. But is that sustainable long-term? Can he really maintain this grip on power indefinitely, especially with so much uncertainty, on the horizon?
Well, that's the question that keeps, I think, many analysts up at night.
Yeah.
He has ruthlessly eliminated his rivals, silenced critics, and really, I think, built a system where loyalty is paramount.
Yeah.
And dissent is, well, swiftly punished. But power, even when it seems absolute, is a fickle thing.
It really makes you wonder, what will Putin's legacy be? How will history ultimately judge this complex, I think it's fair to say, contradictory figure who has dominated the world stage for so long?
It's far too early to say for sure, but one thing is for certain. Vladimir Putin has left an indelible mark on Russia and the world, and his story, well, it's far from over.
It certainly is. Gives you a lot to think about, and that's what these deep dives are all about, giving you the information, the context to draw your own conclusions. So thanks for joining us on this journey into the enigmatic world of Vladimir Putin. And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and keep diving deeper.